Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the New York Public Library, whether you're here with us in person or virtually. I'm Martha Hodes, the Interim Director of the Cullman Center for Scholars and Writers. Just before we get started, please be aware that this event is being recorded. For those of you here with us, we kindly request that you wear a mask for the duration of the program, and we have masks to give away, so feel free to signal if you would like one. For virtual attenders, real-time captions are available by clicking on the closed caption button, or for a live transcript, use the stream text link shared in the reminder email or chat. Okay. This evening, we continue our spring lineup of conversations from the Cullman Center, presenting Cullman Fellow Hernan Diaz, talking about his new novel, Trust, with the esteemed Jean Strouse. Let me just say a word about the Cullman Center. We select 15 fellows each year who come to the library to gain access to our unparalleled collections in order to write the books of tomorrow. Our fellows are among the best and most promising: academics and independent scholars, fiction writers and poets, journalists, translators, playwrights, dramatists, and artists at work today. Writers and scholars from any country are welcome to apply, and the application for the next cycle will very soon be available on our website. Also, if you have an NYPL library card or live in New York State and would like to apply for one, you can borrow Hernan Diaz's Trust for free, or you can buy the book at the library shop, and proceeds do benefit the library. You can find links to buy the book on the book event page, nypl.org/conversations. You can also see everything the library has to offer by signing up for our newsletter at nypl.org/connect. All programs are made possible through the generosity of patrons like you, so please consider supporting the library however you can. Now to this evening. Our guests will converse for 35 or 40 minutes and then take your questions. For those of you here in the room with us, you can write your questions on the cards and pencils you see on the chairs nearby, and program staff will then collect the cards shortly before Q&A. If you are watching online, please share your question in the chat or by emailing cullmancenter@nypl.org. And now to our speakers. Hernan's interlocutor this evening is Jean Strouse, who served as director of the Cullman Center for 14 years. Jean is the author of the magisterial biography Morgan, American Financier, and of Alice James, a biography, which won the Bancroft Prize in American History. You may have read Jean's writings in the New York Times, the New Yorker, the New York Review of Books, or Slate. She's been a MacArthur Foundation Genius Fellow and is currently finishing a book about the portrait painter John Singer Sargent. Jean will be speaking tonight with Hernan Diaz. Hernan's first novel, In the Distance, was a Pulitzer Prize Finalist, a Publisher's Weekly Top 10 Book of the Year, and one of Literary Hub's 20 best novels of the decade. Hernan has won fellowships and awards from the Guggenheim Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation, the Whiting Foundation, McDowell, and Yaddo, and you may have caught him on the New York Times Book Review podcast, NPR Weekend Edition, or WNYC. His work has been translated into over 20 languages. The novel he'll discuss tonight, Trust, has already been called consistently surprising by the New York Times and eccentrically ambitious by Harper's Magazine. It's a book about history and fiction, politics and finance, marriage and intimacy. Please join me in warmly welcoming Jean Strouse and Hernan Diaz.
Thank you, Martha. Oh, we need to pull these closer. Can you hear me? So when I first read this brilliant book a few months ago in Galleys, as soon as I finished, I wanted to go back and read it all over again, because it's full of mysteries, of shifting perspectives, of wit, of gorgeous writing, and once I learned some things at the end, I wanted to go back and see how he did it. But who has time to read a book twice? It's even a great one. But then I said I would have this conversation tonight, and I thought, well, I'll just go back and skim it a little bit to sharpen my memories. Forget it. I got completely caught up in it all over again, and it was a huge, huge pleasure to see how anyway, Hernan has wrought the magic that is in this book. So I highly recommend it. If you haven't read it once, do that first, and then read it again. One of the superb reviews of this book, and there have been many, this one's by Jonathan D. in Harper's. He says, "Trust is a story about the fight over control of a story." So shall we start by having you give people a quick overview of the book?
But actually no, let's start elsewhere. Let's start with the part where I thank you for being here. And, your work is all over this book. You're such an enormous influence. Of course, your book on Morgan, but also your book on Alice James. And one of my greatest joys of having become a fellow here is the friendships I've made. There are some friends from our weird year here, but also having met you and developed this new friendship and the many conversations we've had beyond this public one. So thank you for braving this brutal weather and coming out and for reading the book. Control of the narrative.
Right.
I knew at first that I wanted to write a book about extreme wealth, not just privilege, but I wanted to write a book about the richest man in the world. I'm not entirely sure why I wanted to do that. Oh, hi. And but it was something that I was very drawn to. And the more I asked myself this question and delved into sort of the American canon that I thought would be pertinent for the book, I discovered that there were very few books written about money making. In most of the books about money in the American canon, the money has already been made. It's not being made. And this distinction was to me very interesting. But it was still a very scattered project, and it really coalesced and took shape around the control of the narratives, because there's something very uniform about the myths around wealth in America, the self-made man, and it's always these self-aggrandizing myths that tend to sort of suppress all the other presences that go into a great fortune. And this is going to be a bit of a spoiler, but I think it's in most reviews, so I think I'm going to say it. It's when I discovered that the autobiography of this great man, I decided, what if a woman, in fact, writes this autobiography ghost writes it for him? And this first subversion led to others. And ultimately what I discovered, and this speaks very much to the notion of controlling the narrative, is that as much as art and literature are determined by commerce and material forces, the opposite is just as true. Power needs narratives in order to perpetuate itself. So narratives have a direct influence on reality. And this, to me, was immediately one of the most fascinating things about the project, how a narrative could alter reality. Yeah.
So we should say quickly, for those who haven't read it, that the book consists of 4 different parts, 4 stories told in different voices. And in a minute, we're going to ask Hernan to read from one of them, and then we'll scatter the others throughout. But that's partly why the perspectives keep shifting, because they're told that the first is a novel, the second is a sort of autobiography by this central character, the third is someone else who comes in to help him write his memoir, and the fourth is a mystery, for now.
Yes.
So it's kind of an act of ventriloquism in a way. You've created these voices, and I want to ask you about one of them in a minute, but do you want to start by reading from...
Yeah.
The first section is called Bonds.
The first section is called Bonds, and it's written by a fictional novelist. He doesn't exist in real life. His name is Harold Vanner, and it's written in a slightly decadent tone that I was striving for. It's very much intentional. So it's a work of fiction, but this work of fiction is what sets off the entire narrative in the book. The publication of this, we never get to meet the author, but the publication of this novel sets all the events in motion. And I guess I'm also wondering here what the power of fiction is, right? So I'm going to read a very, very short passage. It's 3 minutes long, where we meet this financier in his childhood. Limited for the most part to his and his nursemaid's rooms, Benjamin had only a vague notion of the rest of the brownstone where he grew up. When his mother and her friends were there, he was kept away from the rooms where they smoked, played cards, and drank sauterne well into the night. When they were gone, the main floors became a dim succession of shuttered windows, covered furniture, and chandeliers in ballooning shrouds. His lonely upbringing did not prepare him for boarding school. During the first term, he became the object of daily indignities and small cruelties. In time, however, his classmates discovered that his impassiveness made him a dissatisfying victim and left him alone. He kept to himself and excelled dispassionately in every subject. During his senior year, his father died of heart failure. At the service, back in New York, relatives and acquaintances alike were impressed by Benjamin's composure, but the truth was that mourning simply had given the natural dispositions of his character a socially recognizable form. His mother spent her brief widowhood with her friends in Rhode Island. She went in May, shortly before Benjamin's graduation, and by the end of the summer had died from emphysema. The family and friends who attended the second, much more subdued memorial barely knew how to speak to the young man orphaned in the course of a mere few months. Fortunately, there were many practical issues to discuss: trusts, executors, and the legal challenges in settling the estate. Benjamin's experience as a college student was an amplified echo of his years as a schoolboy. All the same inadequacies and talents were there, but now he seemed to have acquired a cold sort of fondness for the former and a muted disdain for the latter. Some of the more salient traits of his lineage appear to have come to an end with him. He could not have been more different from his father, who had owned every room he had walked into and made everyone in it gravitate around him, and he had nothing in common with his mother, who had probably never spent a day of her life alone. These discrepancies with his parents became even more accentuated after his graduation. He moved back from New England to the city and failed where most of his acquaintances thrived. He was an inept athlete, an apathetic clubman, an unenthusiastic drinker, an indifferent gambler, a lukewarm lover. He who owned his fortune to tobacco did not even smoke. Those who accused him of being excessively frugal failed to understand that in truth he had no appetites to repress.
Right. Yes, quite a character, this man at the center of this book. Did you think early on, you were talking about controlling the story, of doing it in these different voices, or did that evolve as you went along?
It was very early on. I thought there had to be different voices because, to such an enormous extent, the book is about having or being denied a voice. Mm-hmm. So I thought it would be proper to dramatize this, to make that a formal. I don't want to use the word conceit, but a formal aspect of the novel. Initially, the voices were going to be intertwined, but it felt like I had read that book before, and it felt nicer sort of to be deeply immersed in one narrative, and then there would be another one that would challenge everything that you had learned, or even the way in which you had learned to read previously. That was the ultimate goal.
Right.
Yeah.
So 3, or at least 2.5 of your narrators are very good writers. One is not.
No.
And we'll get to him in a minute, to his passage, but he is full of cliches and self-congratulation and sort of saccharine sentimentality. Was it fun or hard for you to write in that voice?
It was a nightmare.
It was a nightmare.
It was a nightmare. It was a nightmare. And this is the second book. It's called My Life, written by this bombastic sort of man-spreading tycoon. And you know, it was written mostly during the Trump years, so it was also like it was there all the time, and then it was on the page. And
I wish the Trump years were totally in the past, but okay.
Oh yeah, fair enough. But he was in office, and no, I wish I could say I relished in the sort of in creating some sort of straw man, but no, it was tough to write. But I came up with this formal device by which this part is. It's a work in progress. It's not. You realize this very soon. I'm not giving anything away. But that allowed the whole thing, what otherwise would have been ponderous, and it becomes slightly cubist and shattered in ways that I think sometimes are kind of pretty to me. But I must confess, like I sort of tried to create this capital of goodwill with the reader through the book that I just read to you. And then I just burned through it in the second book, like burned through it. And then the job was to rebuild that capital in the following books. But that was part of the experiment, of formal experiment of the book.
And
too.
I mean, much about this book is very witty, and there are moments in this second narrative by the character when he's sort of going along, and he sort of has notes to self. He talks about his parents' wedding, and then he says, more about mother. Like, that's what...
Right, but that was very intentional,
I
and
know.
its placing on the page is also very intentional. I drove typesetters insane, and they were very kind to me, because it would go back and back and back, because I wanted each page to look graphically in a specific way. So, but yes, his mother, of course, is exiled from the narrative. He has nothing to say about his mother, or, you know... And that speaks also to the place of women in these narratives of capital and power that have been pushed aside into the margin. Yeah.
But you pushed them to the front.
That was the idea. Yeah.
Do you want to give us a bit of Andrew Bevel?
I'll give you a very short bit, because this is exactly a minute long. Exactly a minute long, and it's how it begins, and it'll just for a taste, just to feel the difference with the other book. Preface. My name is known to many, my deeds to some, my life to few. This has never concerned me much. What matters is the tally of our accomplishments, not the tales about us. Still, because my past has so often overlapped with that of our nation, lately I have come to believe that I owe it to the public to share some of the decisive moments of my story. I cannot say, in all honesty, that I'm writing these pages in order to indulge the desire, so frequent in men my age, to talk about myself. Over the years, I have been loath to make statements of any kind. This ought to be proof enough that I have never been inclined to discuss my doings out in the open. Rumors have surrounded me most of my life. I have grown accustomed to them and take care never to deny gossip and tales. Denial is always a form of confirmation. Yet I confess that the urge to address and refute some of these fictions has become pressing, especially since the passing of my beloved wife, Mildred. So that's the first thing we hear from from Andrew Bevel.
Although it's deeply rooted in character and personal relationships, Trust is epic in scope, and you you write with a deep knowledge about so many things, including finance, math, the experience of madness, Swiss sanatorium treatments, the history of psychiatry, labor history, music, literature, languages, female experience, the Gilded Age, anarchists, immigrants, typesetting, archival research, just to name a few. So, but it never feels worked up. You never feel the research in the process of reading it. And I assume you didn't know all that at the outset.
No.
And yet you managed to fold your research into the narrative in really incredibly deft ways. So how hard was that? And did you ever get clogged up with too much
Well,
research information?
I'm very trepidatious to talk about research in front of you, Jean, because you know everything there is to know about this period.
But
literally.
Then I don't have to make up a
Nobody
novel
knows
about it.
more. Nobody. So I feel like an imposter in this regard. And so this is where I have two things to say. The first thing is my approach to research. Whenever I feel the urge to create a little shrine for some tchotchke that I found in some collection and just look at this,
Cool thing.
yeah, and write around it, that's a red light. That should absolutely never happen. The research needs to go away, and it should never become sort of a factual straitjacket. Research, to me, should allow me to imagine things that were unimaginable before I had access to these materials. That's what it does for me. I'm not a stickler. I'm not concerned with referential accuracy. Like I don't want to be grossly wrong or anachronistic, but that's not what I'm after. Which leads to the second part. So many of the things that you mentioned are, in all honesty, made up. A lot of them are acts of imagination, and it's weird that imagination has become a slightly obscene word. Like I feel a little awkward every time I use it, but maybe it's just me.
Not around here.
Not around here. Good. So I don't know if this answers your question, but I try to leave air to imagine things. I don't want to get lost in the factual labyrinth. I'm very.
Well, you don't. So
Yeah.
So names and titles play a very interesting, useful role in this whole book. Trust is
Yes.
both a financial instrument and a human value and many other things as well, and bonds, the title of the novel within the novel, the first one, human bonds
Yeah.
and financial bonds. I didn't really find a meaning for Bevel, but maybe you had one, the name of the character.
Futures also is a
Futures,
financial
that's right.
instrument.
Sorry, futures, yes.
Bevel. Here's the story with Bevel. When I was looking for names, my family and I, we were in New England, and I couldn't come up with names on vacation. And I went to all these little cemeteries and looking for like names. I couldn't find any names. For a long time I looked, and then I went to Henry James's notebooks, where he famously has lists. Some names are ridiculous and Dickensian, but he has lists of names that are totally made up. And I was like, oh yes, I just need to make up the name. It doesn't have to be a name. And Bevel had a music that I liked, and also, of course, this kind of, Bevel that tells something about the way in which we look at the story. Mm-hmm. Same thing for Rask, invented, and Vanner is also invented.
Which? Oh, Vanner, yes.
Vanner,
right,
yeah.
Right.
Yeah, which is kind of vain, but also vanish, and I don't know, I like that name.
Right. Well, Henry James, names are never accidental. So
Oh no!
there we
Sometimes
go.
they're very heavy-handed too.
Yes, indeed.
Yes.
Miss Peabody, for instance. That brings us to Ida Partenza.
Yes.
And Partenza in Italian is departure.
Yes.
As you
And
well
yes,
know.
but Ida in Spanish is also a form of departure.
Yes.
Yes. So I double down on that. Ida Partenza is everything I wish I were. You know, she's very effective in the world, and she's the daughter of an Italian anarchist in Brooklyn, and you know, she teaches herself how to type and accounting, and becomes a writer of prominence. You know, has a great career. Yeah. But she starts as secretary, which is the way in which many women find their way into sort of the white-collar labor force back in the 20s and 30s. Yeah.
And she lands quite a job in this novel.
She lands quite a job. She ends up becoming the blow-hearted man we just heard from, Andrew Bevel. She becomes his secretary eventually. Yes.
And the ghostwriter of his memoir.
And the ghostwriter, this was a big no-no for me to spoil this, but it has been spoiled. No, everywhere. No, I don't mean you. Like I said it before you did a moment ago, but every time I say it, but yeah, that happens. She is indeed the woman who wrote that very sort of self-aggrandizing prose you just heard.
It wasn't what she wanted to write. She was sort of pushed by Bevel into doing it. She would have done it in a much better way.
Yes. Do you want to hear from her?
Sure.
Okay. So here we meet Ida. This is the beginning of her book. Her book is called A Memoir Remembered. And this is the longest passage I'm going to read, and it's 4 minutes. Is that okay? Okay. So now it's 1985. Oh, this is in the thing. The panel doors, shut to most of the world for decades, are now open. The panel doors, shut to most of the world for decades, are now open to the public Tuesday through Sunday from 10 a.m. to 6 p.m. For years, I avoided the main entrance to Bevel House on 87th Street between Madison and Fifth Avenue. Now and then, walking through the park, I would catch a glimpse of the building's top floor through the foliage, the limestone darkening with the seasons, the blinds closed regardless of them. About 6 years ago, however, I found the shuttered windows open. A piece in the Times appeared a few weeks later saying that after a protracted litigation over the estate, work would finally start to turn the house into the museum it had been intended to become following Andrew Bevel's death. Shortly after, the mansion was scaffolded and wrapped up in mesh. Renovations began. Some 2 years later, in the spring of 1981, every publication in New York featured articles on Bevel House, the city's latest gem, a historical treasure, a cultural jewel. The New Yorker asked me to write something on the reopening of the house without knowing I was once connected to it. I declined. 4 years went by. The flurry of attention around Bevel House died down, and the building became one more dutiful stop on Museum Mile. I, too, forgot about Bevel House. Living downtown, I found it easy enough to avoid the building and even exile its image from my mind. Sometimes a random chain of associations would take my thoughts back to the house and reawaken my curiosity. Whenever I was visiting a friend or running an errand on the Upper East Side and chance took me to that stretch of Fifth Avenue, I would pause by the elaborate fence that separates the setback garden from the sidewalk and look up at the windows. Still, moved by a wordless superstition, I always kept from the entrance on East 87th Street. But then, a few months ago, around the time of my 70th birthday, I happened to read in Smithsonian Magazine that the Bevel Foundation had recently placed the personal papers of Andrew and Mildred Bevel at the collection. The archives include correspondence, engagement calendars, scrapbooks, inventories, and notebooks documenting the lives of Mr. and Mrs. Bevel, states the brief article. Those materials provide a unique insight into the history of a couple whose philanthropic legacy continues to shape America's public and cultural life to this day. Perhaps because I had just turned 70, this news, learning those documents were available, had a profound effect on me. I have never cared much for anniversaries or decimal fetishes of any kind. Still, I could not stop thinking about the events that have shaped my writing life throughout almost 5 decades, and the bevel papers at the beginning of it all. And this is why I find myself facing these implausibly open doors on this fall morning, to revisit the place where I became a writer, to look for the answer to the enigmas I thought had to be left unresolved so they could feed my work, and to finally meet, even if it is only through her papers, Mildred Bevel. It is dusky inside. 2 women hesitate on the edge of darkness, pore over a map, and finally vanish. After staring at the facade for a while, I realize it is not the building I am looking at, but my memories that, like tracing paper, cover it. I once worked in this house, but I never used the main door. I was always admitted through the service entrance. That was almost half a century ago. All I see beyond the panel doors is shadows. I walk in.
I pulled out 2 quotes from the younger Ida Partenza that I just want to read to you because they're so good. When she's first on Wall Street meeting this man who's going to hire her as a secretary, there's construction going on next that they can see through the window, another high rise, and she sort of, well, this is the observation in the text, and we assume it's her recollection. Like impossible canoes, steel beams hanging from unseen wires cruised through the sky. And a little later, she notes that authority and money surround themselves with silence, and one can measure the reach of someone's influence by the thickness of the hush enveloping them. Just, not that I need to read them, because you did such a great job.
Thank you.
And one more thing that I will read, and then I think you can go on to your 4th section of reading.
Sure.
I'm not going to say too much about this because it's part of the mystery, but this is someone suffering rather acutely. Her speculations reflected each other like parallel mirrors, and endlessly each image inside the vertiginous tunnel looked at the next, wondering whether it was the original or a reproduction. This, she told herself, was the beginning of madness, the mind becoming the flesh for its own teeth. And she felt increasingly lost in the tyrannical architecture of her brain.
Yeah, these passages are both from the novel, the first book I read,
Right.
and I find that I happen to love those passages, so thank you for highlighting them. And as I was writing this book, it was also the awareness of women in these narratives of power, specifically being pushed to the roles of wife and secretary for the most part, which I play with overtly in the book, as you just heard, but also victim, and very often victims of themselves.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Someone once said, and one of my editors said, history is subject to the tyranny of the articulate.
Whoa.
Isn't that great? So, I mean, if you're writing about the control of the story, who's telling this story? Isn't that an amazing quote?
Oh, yes.
Yeah, so it's yours, it's everybody's.
That's great.
So, I mean, I was thinking of it throughout this story, like who's telling the story and who sets what we think about what's going on.
Well, the anarchist father here has a quote that is kind of along the same vein. He says, history is a fiction with an army.
Right, right.
So, that would be the distinction between what we take sort of a misguided account of the past, or a fictional account of the past, and fact is the power behind that narrative.
Right.
Yeah.
Doesn't he say right after that something like reality is fiction with money or something like? It's not quite right.
It's a fiction with unlimited budget.
With unlimited
yes.
budget, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Your mind
Yeah.
goes spinning.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So, do you want to read the fourth?
Yeah.
Your fourth?
So this is. I just came back from doing a bunch of events in different cities, which was enormous fun, and I sort of learned how to speak about the book. And I always want to share a little bit from the last section, but it's full of either revelations or confirmations, depending on how you read the book. Maybe you saw it coming all along, and that's fine.
No.
Or it's a revelation. But this is why I have a printout, because I find a way to sort of cull different passages from this section into a little thing of its own. And it lends itself to that because this is a personal diary written by the wife of the real-life tycoon in the novel. She's very ill. She's in Switzerland. It's the 30s, early 30s, 1930s. She's on a lot of morphine and in pain. So she's a little disoriented, too, in time. So the entries read AM, PM, and Eve. This is 2 minutes and a half. And don't expect for this to make sense. PM. I speak imperfect German with nurse. She sticks with her imperfect English. We both pretend this is all perfectly natural. PM. Nothing more private than pain. It can involve only one. But who? Who is I in I hurt? The one who inflicts the pain or the one who suffers it? And does hurt refer to the inflicting or the suffering? PM, mandatory 90-minute rest, wrapped up on chaise longue under warmish sun. Air like French horns. AM, the loneliness of animals I aspire to. PM, unreasonable menu, beef tea thickened with tapioca, meat jelly, milk. PM, seized with toothache, loose molar. Overheard, the most charming garbage. PM, a diarist is a monster. The writing hand and the reading eye are sourced from different bodies. AM, walked with nurse to the edge of the forest. Some trees creaked with age, delicious greenness. Pressed my hand into a mound of warm moss. Watched it spring back slowly, erasing my impression. Seized with pain, had to lie down under a tree. Can't remember when I last lay on grass, leaves, lichen. Rested my head on nurse's lap. She stroked my hair. Sweet damp sounds and smells from the ground. Clusters of clouds against the wrinkled sky. She must have thought my tears were of pain. PM, lost offending molar. Don't think there'll be time for the hole to close.
Yeah. I'm going to go from that to a sort of internal joke in the book.
Okay.
Which is, I mean, maybe not. Should we stay with that? It's pretty
no,
powerful.
we need a joke.
Well, in the book, there's a review of the Harold Vanner book, Bonds, which is the one you read first, the novel. And of this novel, The Atlantic says, even those narratives that attempt a critique of affluence and inequality almost always end up dazzled by the ostentatious greed they set out to demystify, a pitfall Mr. Vanner deftly avoids. A pitfall Mr. Diaz deftly avoids.
Oh, thank
You didn't write that part, but I mean, it's funny to slip that in there.
Thank you. I used a bit of that language for my application to the Cullman Center. It's true. I thought that was going to be the joke.
No, I didn't read your application, so that passed my time. We're almost ready for questions. I'm going to give you another...
That would be fun.
What? It will be fun.
Yeah.
There's another lovely quote from Jonathan D. when he says, Hernan Diaz is one of the least derivative, most eccentrically ambitious fiction writers I've read in a long time. That's pretty great.
I don't know quite what to do with
You don't have to do anything with it. And Michael Gora, who reviewed the book in the Sunday New York Times, this is a little bit long, but he was reflecting on the novel's recognizing the human costs of a great fortune, even though its characters can see nothing beyond their own calculations. They are most enthralled by the abstraction of money itself. Diaz gives an extreme form of that fascination to his most attractive character, who says, "Short selling is folding back time, the past making itself present in the future, like a modernist writer dealing with the flux and flow of consciousness. The speaker of those words cannot even imagine that such a fortune might hide a crime. That doesn't mean there isn't one."
Just to add something to
Yes,
that,
please.
there was a very intentional trajectory formally in the book, which is we begin with this novel within the novel that is very sort of turn of the century, the voice, right? And we end with those kind of scattered segments that I've just read to you in what I hope is sort of a love letter to high modernism, and it's very influenced by my heroes from those, the 20s and the 30s. And so I think there is this formal arc in the book that I think the passage you read is addressing in a beautiful way too. But I just wanted to say that there's a conversation between forms and different literary sort of currents within the book too. Yeah.
Yes, but it's very subtle, so if you're not tuned into those things,
It's
there,
It's not required knowledge.
Right.
It's just a layer that you may or may not pick up on. Or
Yeah, but Michael Gora would definitely pick up on it.
Yes.
So here's our first question. The cadences in your writing are wonderful to hear this evening. Do you read drafts aloud as you write?
Oh, thank you. That's very nice. In this case, it's different with every book, In this case, during, I think, the third proof or something, I read the entire novel to myself back, and I did a lot of corrections and tweaks. But I have to say that for me, literature is, to an enormous extent, a visual event. Syntax is something that I look at, and I like to see how it works on the page. And I look at every page also as a page, and look at the density of it as a page, design-wise. And my writing is very much informed by that. And I think it's not for nothing. I mean, punctuation works. If you're mindful of it, and then you read it, it should translate into speech. But I'm mostly again a visual writer for sure. But yeah, mindful of the music of the words too. Yeah.
And music in general, obviously.
And music in general, which plays an enormous part in the book.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well, this is a related question about process. How often do you draft and redraft, and do you ever use a thesaurus to find the right word?
No, I don't use it. Oh yeah, maybe I use a thesaurus every now and then. I don't draft. That I don't do. That's not the way I work. It's I'm not saying obviously it's the way to do it. A lot of people draft. I edit very minutely and obsessively and carefully every day. Most of my writing day is editing what I already have, and comparatively, new material is just a few hundred words every day. it's mostly going over and over and over and over. So when I'm done, I'm
You're done.
I'm done. There isn't a second draft. More than a thesaurus, what I use and I recommend to everyone is the unabridged Oxford English Dictionary, which is expensive, but if you have online, but if you have an institutional subscription, maybe you can get it through the New York Public Library. Yes, I'm getting a nod. It's incredible for many reasons. I can talk about the OED for a long time. I'm not going to do it. Yeah.
What did you discover in NYPL collections during your fellowship that was most inspiring to your work?
Yeah, well, it
Besides
was...
the OED.
No, that predates
I'm sure.
the New York Public Library. Well, I had a very bizarre experience here as a Cullman Fellow last year because it was at the height of the pandemic when we were all very, very frightened and wearing our homemade hazmat suits and quarantining. Our books were quarantined here for like 3 days before you could touch them, right? You couldn't like go and get a book. I couldn't get any of the manuscripts that I wanted to consult because that means being with a curator in the same room, which was not okay at the time. I have some former fellows who were kind enough to come here, and they must remember all of this. So all of that I couldn't do, but I could do a lot of other things. And I think the most wonderful thing that I discovered here was press from the 20s and 30s. I worked a lot with entire Fortune collection, Fortune magazine collection, the Forbes magazine collection, and I worked a lot with magazines. I worked a lot with prints. Mostly media from the time. That's what I relied on.
Were some of those digitized, or was it all the actual magazines?
No. It was the actual, and that also the format, the huge format, very unwieldy. That was a good experience, and a lot of it made it to the book. But also, just as you were saying, the process of researching itself, the process itself, is part of the book. And I also, I forgot. Anarchism plays a role in the Italian anarchism plays a role in the book, and that's a history that's been erased, as I say in the book. Like I put all of this, all my findings in the novel, and even here I could find only broken collections of those journals in Italian in microfiche. I do this because it's kind of what you do, so that was fascinating to see the lacunae in the gaps of what is available to us was fascinating. I also worked not here with manuscripts and personal papers from some of the real life wives of real life American tycoons, and that was also a very interesting experience. I think I'm forgetting something, but yeah.
I think it was during your year during the pandemic where the Cullman Center Fellows were pretty much the only people requesting books within the library.
Yeah.
And so they came really quickly, even if you had to wait to touch them.
Yes.
But I think that's been unique usually there are lots of other people requesting books too. It doesn't come in 15 minutes.
I told you the Falcon story, right? No? One day, only staff could come, and sometimes, there was nobody here, not a figure of speech. And one day, I'm walking in, and there is security guards were always here. Those were the people who were always here, and there was a kerfuffle. I didn't understand what was going on. Keep walking, and then I see on the steps right here a falcon. Like this size, and I tell a security guard, I said, "There's a falcon," and she goes, "The bird is here." And everyone ran up, and then the falcon took off and glided down sort of the marbled corridor. It was beautiful and sad too, because it felt really apocalyptic, but it was one of those. It was a sublime. Weird moment, and that encapsulates my experience here. It was very strange.
And how did they? I hope they got it out of the library.
They got it out. It ended. It doesn't end so poetically. It ended predictably with the falcon crashing into a window, and then, no. I was assured that it was okay. Yes. Yes.
Well,
But I left the scene. It got dark and sad, and yeah.
well, speaking of that year and flying things, Peter Cooper, who's sitting here,
Oh, yeah.
also populated the library with insects and butterflies and moths and the most magical things, because there was no one in the library, and so he put all these, he's a cartoonist, sorry, he didn't actually put moths in the library, he drew them in the library. You might have seen some of them in the New Yorker. It's still up, right? The exhibition is on the 3rd floor. I highly recommend you go up there after this and take a look, because it's magical.
Oh, it's incredible. You should definitely go.
Do we have time for one more, Lauren?
You've got a few more minutes.
Okay. Andrew Bevel hijacks Ida's memory. Why? There's more. Of all the characters, which was your favorite? Did your attitude towards extreme wealth, I'm not sure I can read this, the life shift while writing this book?
Yeah, I think I get the,
Yeah.
So it's a tripartite question.
Yes.
So for a little context, while Ida is the secretary of this extremely wealthy man, she writes her own memories into his memoir because he won't tell her a lot about his own private life. So that would be the first reason. But then, and this is something, that I see all the time, big narcissists, egomaniac men in general, they will sort of gaslight you and quote you back the thing that you had just said as if you hadn't said it. Mm-hmm. And that to me is such a crazy thing to do that I wanted that in writing in the book. So he's a parasite, he's greedy in every single possible regard, not just about money, but also about narratives. So that's why he does it.
So he tells her a story as if it's his own, that she, in fact, had supplied to him.
Thank you for providing clarity. Yes.
Just a little footnote.
There were other parts, but I don't know if my opinion of extremely wealthy people has not improved. That's an easy one.
Which was your favorite character?
Oh, favorite character. Well, I said a moment ago, I wish I were more like Ida because she's so effective out in the world, which I am famously not in a practical sense. And she is, and she's very brave, which I'm also not. And so I really like her a lot. But my heart is with Mildred, and I feel. I was sad when she let me go. She broke up with me. It was over.
She had to.
She had to. But yeah, and it's also a character where I feel personally very exposed, in a way that I don't anywhere else in the book. So that's always, to use a financial term, that investment makes you very close
vulnerable.
to.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's interesting that there are two father-daughter pairs sort of in the center of this book, which is very powerful. Although, actually, one is fictional, but in bonds.
Oh, right. Yeah. That to me was another relationship that I wanted to explore. The father-daughter, and I think both fathers here are very strong presences, and they have a lot in common. Which is sort of they are unbendingly dogmatic about very different things. One is a sort of a Swedenborgian mystic, and the other one is an anarchist. So they couldn't be farther apart from each other. But and also as a father, this is something that terrifies me, of sort of being sort of that paternal inflexibility that seems to come with the role to some extent, according to psychoanalysis, the law and the father and all of that. And it's something that I abhor and try to be like very careful about in real life. And I had a father who was also sort of politically very active and was also, walked around the world wagging his finger. So I kind of lived through that too.
You're not going to do that, I imagine.
I try every day. Yeah.
I can't remember, not going to remember this exactly, but you will. Ida, I believe, says about herself and Mildred, we were both trying to grow up in small crevices, something like that.
Yeah, and break them up as they. Yeah. So again, I feel the book is, and I'm fully aware of the paradox of I'm a male writer taking this on, and that was, to me, something very frightening to write about. And I'm quoting you the female experience you said at the very opening, which I found very touching. But I felt it was a risk that was important for me as a writer and as a person to take, and also I because otherwise we're also turning literature into some sort of selfie. If you can only do this self-reflective kind of thing. So it was an exercise in, I would say, moral imagination or ethical imagination to try to think how it must be to be given this little crevice and that's the only thing you can find purchase on to hopefully grow and hopefully perhaps even break it open further and expand, and that is something that was very important to me in the book, to try to make myself imagine that from that very specific place. Yeah.
This book is very different from In the Distance, your previous novel, which we won't go into in detail here, but it's also quite wonderful in very different ways. I think it's the mark of a distinction in a writer to challenge himself, herself, to set off in a completely new direction, which you've certainly done. Do you have a next novel in your mind, or not yet?
I do, but I'm not superstitious, but I also feel that something terrible will happen to me if I talk about it.
No, I'm not asking you to talk about it, just whether you have it, the idea.
Well, as I said before, it all starts with things that need to find a way to coalesce. So there are things trying to find a way to coalesce.
Good.
Yes.
I think that's probably a good place for us to stop. So thank you all for coming. And there are books for sale in the rear of the room. And then Hernan will be signing books for you just outside the doors where you came in, if you choose to buy one.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. It means a lot. Thank you.
Pleasure.